and for the very generous introduction. And I want to begin, of course, by thanking Yemima, Amit, Cedric, Paul, and everyone else who helped put this together. As those of you sitting here know, I'm the 10th speaker today, the 20th speaker of our conference of 2 days. And I want to thank you all for being here. And I'm glad you were able to have a little bit of wine beforehand. I've learned a tremendous amount in the last 2 days. It's hard to believe it's only 2 days. I think that much of what we've seen is testament, obviously, to the breadth and not just the depth of. Oh, actually, this is supposed to go back. Of Buber's thought. Okay, of Buber's thought. But I think it's also testament to Yemima and the other organizers for putting this together so well in these different panels. I know this is not an easy thing to do. You actually made it coherent in advance instead of making everyone thinking afterwards, how did that go together? So thank you for that. And so one of the things I'm going to try and do today is to try and reflect on some of the ways in which some of our themes have come up already. And so thank you for that. Okay. So here we go. And by the way, as you'll see, I was originally going to talk about Bertha Pappenheim as well, but I chose not to. Had I heard Abigail's talk first, I would have incorporated it, but I'm going to reflect on it here. Okay. In the context of today's culture wars, Martin Buber would probably be surprised to find himself on the conservative or even on the reactionary side of things. 100 years after the publication of I Am Thou, it can be hard not to wince at Buber's association of the womb of the Great Mother and his description of primitive peoples. And before I go on, I want to say that I'm very much going to be making an argument in the spirit of what Yemima asked us to do, which is to extend Buber's thought into the 21st century. So I'm going to sound very critical at the beginning, but I'm going to be trying in this paper to try and show how within his thought I think he has some of the answers to the problems that he presents. If we define essentialism simply as, quote, the assumption that groups, categories, or classes of objects have one or several defining features exclusive to all members of that category, end quote, it's difficult not to conclude that Buber is an essentialist when it comes to gender, and that at least some of his language about gender and primitive peoples is not just essentialist, but also colonialist. Such judgments of Buber's thought become even more pronounced when we consider his relegation of traditional gender roles to women in his early Zionist writings, in which he contends that since Judaism and Jewishness begin in the home, the literal and metaphorical rebirth of Judaism must begin with Jewish women. I have stated these judgments boldly and perhaps harshly, not because I have come to condemn Buber at the end of our conference and celebration of a century since I Am Thou was published. Rather, I make such strong statements because I want to indicate that by confronting the problem of Buber's gender essentialism head-on, we might be able to come to a better model for thinking about what Buber might contribute to contemporary feminist thought. So in what follows, I'm going to first be arguing against Buber, but I'm doing so for the sake of arguing for Buber. And so the talk will have 4 parts. In the first part of the paper, I'm going to articulate what I think is the problem of the essentialism of the feminine in Buber's thought by way of Emmanuel Levinas's criticism of Buber. I'm not going to agree with Levinas, just to put it up front. Part 2 brings Buber into dialogue with Donald Winnicott in order to consider more deeply Buber's conception of inclusion. Part 3 turns to some of the ways in which thinking about Buber and Winnicott together might allow us to construct a conception of mothering beyond essence from Buber's philosophy. To do so, I will focus on mutuality, asymmetry, and vulnerability. Finally, the conclusion considers how the argument of this paper might also contribute to a better understanding of Buber's conception of God. So, part 1, articulating the problem. Let us begin with a better sense of the picture of gender that Buber paints in I Am Thou. And we've already heard about some of this, but I hope it bears repeating. In the beginning is relation, and relation begins in the womb. These are not Buber's words, but they're pretty close. Quote, in the beginning is the relation as the category of being, as readiness, as a form that reaches out to be filled, as a model of the soul, the a priori of relation, the innate you, end quote. This innate you, this form that reaches out to be filled, is found in what Buber describes as the womb of the Great Mother. And here I was thinking when I was listening to Galit that perhaps this is the womb of the Great Mother is Buber's maybe a myth of origin, and I think it is deeply connected in I Am Now to the way in which he's going to develop his dialogical philosophy. And so that I think will be interesting to talk about. Quote, every developing human child rests, like all development beings, in the womb of the Great Mother, the undifferentiated, not yet formed primal world. From this it detaches itself to enter a personal life, and it is only in dark hours when we slip out of this again, as happens even to the healthy, night after night, that we are close to her again, end quote. The womb of the Great Mother is an incubator for individual personality. As such, the womb of the Great Mother is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for the individuality of I-it relations, and then for the possibility of the I-thou relation. In this way, the I-thou relation may gestate in the womb, but the child must leave the self-contained, all-encompassing, undifferentiated world of the womb to enter into actual relationships, whether I-thou or I-it. The womb of the Great Mother serves as a launching pad for the decidedly male subject. In Buber's words, quote, whoever loves a woman so that her life is present in his own, the you of her eyes allows him to gaze into a ray of the eternal you, end quote. The masculine is active for Buber, whereas the feminine is passive. The child finds himself ejected from the womb into the world in which he must become self-sufficient. Behind every great man is a great woman, and behind every I-thou is an I-it that has been carried in the great womb. Buber does indeed affirm the feminine, but this is because the feminine is but the staging ground for the individual's twofold attitude towards the world, the I-it and the I-thou. That Buber regards the feminine as the passive springboard for real life is made even more apparent by his reference to sleep. The active, conscious subjects of the I-it and I-thou relations find their way back to the unconscious unity of the womb and the passivity of sleep. And Buber likens the womb of the Great Mother, glimpsed in the passivity of sleep, to the, quote, primitive Zulu, whose speech consists only of, quote, pre-grammatical structures, end quote. In primitive cultures, there are no subjects or objects but the, and here's a quote, the total situation of persons as expressed both in nouns and pronouns, embedded without finished independence. The chief concern is not analysis and reflection, but only true original unity, the lived relation, end quote. Given the explicit and not only implicit links between the primitive Zulu and the womb of the Great Mother that Buber presents in I Am Now, it is hard not to conclude that Buber merely reiterates the most basic tenets of patriarchy and European colonialism. To be sure, Buber admires the primitive culture of the Zulu and longs for the womb of the Great Mother, for both are, in his words, the true original unity and the lived relation. Yet both are, by Buber's own definitions, fundamentally uncivilized, and both are destinations to which the modern civilized person cannot and does not wish to return. Buber may warmly regard the naivete characteristic of life in the womb of the Great Mother and amongst primitive peoples, but both are crude expressions of the love, responsibility, and mutuality found in the mature encounter between I and you. Now, Buber is by no means alone or in any sense original in both valorizing and condescending to the feminine as passive, primitive, and essential. He, like the rest of us, is but the product of his own biography and historical context. Buber longs for the mother who abandoned him, and he does so in the cultural and intellectual contexts of interwar Europe, which simultaneously valorizes and condemns the essentialized and passive feminine subject. For these reasons, if Buber insists on the necessary condition of the womb of the Great Mother for a life of genuine relation, who can really blame him? Yet while recognizing the situatedness of Buber's thought, contemporary readers may be inclined to insist against Buber that gender is not essential, but is rather, in the words of Judith Butler, quote, real only to the extent that it is performed, end quote. Gender for Butler and many others today is by no means tied to material bodily facts, such as wombs, but is solely and completely a social construction, a fiction, one that therefore is open to challenge and contestation. And this is Butler, quote, because gender is not a fact, the various acts of gender create the idea of gender, and without those acts there would be no gender at all. Gender is thus a construction that regularly conceals its genesis, end quote. So ought we conclude then that Buber's contribution to feminist thought today consists in recognizing that his construction of the feminine merely conceals its genesis in outdated social and political ideals? Before attempting to answer this question, and I'm going to answer no, I'd like to draw a connection between the view of the feminine I've just ascribed to Buber, to Emmanuel Levinas's criticism of Buber. And I just want to say, just so it's clear, I do think that Levinas misreads Buber, but I think that his misreading is productive, I hope, for the purposes of this paper. While Levinas arguably essentializes and relegates the feminine to traditional female roles as much, if not much more, than Buber does, Levinas might seem to differ from Buber in rejecting what Buber calls the true original unity of the lived relation, its mutuality. In this, Levinas goes so far as to defend Heidegger against Buber, prefacing his remarks with a qualification that, quote, it is not surely to Heidegger that one should turn to for the instruction in the love of man or social justice. Levinas maintains that unlike Buber's I-thou relation, Heideggerian concern is, quote, a mode of access to the otherness of the other, end quote. Oh, that wasn't yet the slide. But Levinas elaborates. This is the slide, quote. This is what Levinas is saying about Buber's I and thou as opposed to Heideggerian concern. Quote, if the I becomes an I in saying thou, as Buber asserts, then the I resembles all other relations. The encounter is formal and is reversible so that it is indifferent whether it is read from left to right or right to left, end quote. Levinas argues that the mutuality of the I-thou relation turns this relation into an I-it relation. In Levinas's terms, the I-thou relation is ultimately one of sameness or immanence, not of difference or transcendence. But Levinas's description of the I-thou relation, which again I will suggest shortly is inaccurate, might better characterize the oneness of what Buber calls the original unity of, quote, the total situation of persons as expressed both in nouns and pronouns embedded without finished independence, end quote. Levinas suggests that Buber's I and thou means that if I become I in saying you, then I am you and you are me. This fusion of identities from Levinas's perspectives leaves no room for the otherness of the other. Such a relation is not one of responsibility because ethics requires that I am separate from the other. For if I am not separate from the other, then I encounter not the other, but only myself. For Levinas, the relationship between I and the other is not mutual and asymmetrical, as many of you know. Just not as I am not the other and the other is not me, so too I owe the other everything, but the other owes me nothing. With Levinas's criticism of Buber, we can begin to decipher what Buber's contribution to contemporary feminist thought might be. If we apply Levinas's criticism to Buber's construction of the womb of the Great Mother in I and thou, Levinas would be right to worry about the fusion of the I and the other, what Levinas calls their reversibility. But Levinas is wrong to ascribe such fusion or reversibility to the I-thou relation. That's what I'm arguing. As I suggested above, the I-thou relation differs fundamentally from the womb of the Great Mother and from primitive cultures. In fact, this is Buber's basic point. Whereas above, I identified Buber's distinction between the womb of the Great Mother and the I-thou relation as the source of the problem from the point of view of contemporary feminist philosophy, I would now like to suggest that his distinction can be a resource for thinking about how I and thou, 100 years after its publication, might begin to contribute to feminist philosophy. So, part 2. Perhaps somewhat paradoxically, considering Buber's contemporary contribution to feminist thought requires leaving his discussion and women and the womb of the great mother behind. That's my suggestion. By bringing Buber into conversation with Winnicott, we can begin to see that Buber's dialogical relation offers a model of what I will call mothering beyond essence. So Winnicott is well known for his description of the good enough mother. Distancing himself from Freud, Winnicott writes, quote, "There is no possibility whatever for an infant to proceed from the pleasure principle to the reality principle or towards and beyond primary identification unless there is a good enough mother." The good enough mother, who is not necessarily the infant's own mother, is one who makes active adaptation of the infant's needs, an active adaptation that gradually lessens according to the infant's growing ability to account for failure or adaptation and to tolerate the results of frustration. Naturally, the infant's own mother is more likely to be good enough than of some other person, since this active adaptation demands an easy and unresented preoccupation with the one infant. In fact, success in infant care depends on the fact of devotion, not on cleverness or intellectual enlightenment, as anybody knows who has been anywhere near children. The good enough mother starts off with an almost complete adaptation to her infant's needs. And as time proceeds, she adapts less and less completely, gradually according to the infant's growing ability to deal with her failure, end quote. Two initial starting points are important for our discussion of Winnicott and Buber. First, although Winnicott links women to motherhood, he removed particularly essentialist descriptions of women and motherhood in the 1960s in reprints of his earlier works, which suggest that not all women need to be mothers and not all mothers need to be women. He even says that in this earlier piece, and this I think again reminds me of some of our discussion of Pappenheim and her understanding of spiritual motherhood. Second, and as importantly, Winnicott insists on defining the good enough mother not just in terms of her ability to care for her baby, but also for her ability to allow the baby to experience frustration, anxiety, despair, and even hatred. According to Winnicott, quote, "The mother's adaptation to the infant's needs gives the infant the illusion that there is an external reality that corresponds to the infant's own capacity to create," end quote. This, however, is only the first step in being a good enough mother. So it's a little bit too much bold here, but I will read it. The baby says, wordlessly of course, "I just feel like." And just then, the mother comes along and turns the baby over. So she comes with the feeding apparatus, and the baby becomes able to finish the sentence. A turnover, a breast, nipple, milk, etc., etc. We have to say that the baby created the breast, but could not have done so had not the mother come along with the breast just at that moment. The communication to the baby is, quote, "Come at the world creatively, create the world. It is only what you create that has meaning for you," end quote. Next comes, quote, "The world is in your control," end quote. From the initial experience of omnipotence, the baby is able to begin to experience frustration, and even to arrive one day at the other extreme from omnipotence, having a sense of being a mere speck in the universe. It is not from being God that human beings arrive at the humility. Is it not from being God that human beings arrive at the humility proper to human individuality, end quote. For Winnicott, the infant benefits from the experience of frustration since incomplete adaptation to need makes objects real, that is to say, hated as well as loved. So the only way that objects can become real is if the infant is frustrated. Put somewhat differently, a good enough mother allows her baby to be vulnerable, thereby making herself vulnerable as well. A good enough mother is not vulnerable just to the demands of her baby, but also to her, the mother's, own frustration in not meeting all the baby's demands for the sake of the baby. Winnicott famously contends that transitional objects, such as a blanket or a stuffed toy, allow the child to begin to tolerate her own frustration and recognize her mother as separate from herself. Indeed, the human being from birth, quote, is concerned with the problem of the relationship between what is objectively perceived and what is subjectively conceived, end quote. So we see Linus here with his blanket. Already here we find a general like-mindedness between Buber and Winnicott. As Buber puts it, quote, for the inmost growth of the self is not accomplished, as people like to suppose today, in man's relation to himself, but in the relation between the one and the other, between men, that is, preeminently in the mutuality of the making present, in the making present of another self, and in the knowledge that one is made present in his own self by the other, together with the mutuality of acceptance of affirmation and confirmation. The affinity between Buber and Winnicott is made even more apparent when we notice that both describe the relation between self and other in spatial terms. In Winnicott's words, quote, it is the space between inner and outer world, which is also the space between people, the transitional space that intimate relationships and creativity occur, end quote. Note the similarity between Winnicott's transitional space and Buber's between. In this very well-known quotation, this is Buber, quote, on the far side of the subjective, on this side of the objective, on the narrow ridge where I and thou meet, there is the realm of between, end quote. But I want to suggest that the kinship between Buber and Winnicott goes deeper than this and lets us appreciate aspects of Buber's thought that are often either misunderstood or ignored. These features are also exactly those that Levinas overlooks in critiquing Buber, as discussed above. Bringing Buber into conversation with Winnicott allows us to see that, Pache Levinas, Buber affirms a separate self and the otherness of the other. Buber's appeals to the mutuality of acceptance, of affirmation and confirmation, ought not be understood as the merging of the self with the other, what Levinas describes as the indifference to whether the I-thou relation is read from left to right or right to left. Instead, like Winnicott's conception of transitional space, Buber's between is a place in which I meet you by becoming me. This does not mean that I become you or you become me, but rather that I only experience my separateness from you by being in relationship with your actual otherness. Mutuality, acceptance, affirmation, and confirmation are not warm, fuzzy, and static. They are instead challenging, difficult, and fluid. We can begin to see this more sober side of Buber in its explicit rejection of empathy. And a very long quotation here, quote, it would be wrong to identify what is meant here with the familiar term empathy. Empathy means to glide with one's own feeling into the dynamic structure of an object, a pillar or a crystal or the branch of a tree, or even of an animal or a man, as it were to trace it from within, understanding the formation and materiality of the object without the perception of one's own muscles. It means to transpose oneself over there and in there. Thus, empathy means the exclusion of one's own concreteness, the extinguishing of the actual situation of life, the absorption in pure aestheticism of the reality in which one participates. Inclusion, Umfassung, is the opposite of this. It is the extension of one's own concreteness, the fulfillment of the actual situation of life, the complete presence of the reality in which one participates. Its elements are, first, a relation of no matter what kind between two persons, second, an event experienced by them in common, in which at least one of them actively participates, and third, the fact that this one person, without forfeiting anything of the felt reality of his activity, at the same time lives through the common event from the standpoint of the other. A relation between persons that is characterized in more or less degree by the element of inclusion may be termed a dialogical relation. Note that Buber states that inclusion is the opposite of empathy. Inclusion means neither I nor you give up our separateness, while nevertheless being able to meet each other as each experiences herself. This is not easy. It is a situation of mutual vulnerability. I make myself vulnerable to you, not by merging my experience with yours, but rather by holding you together with me. Focusing on Buber's term Umfassung, Levinas criticizes Buber for turning dialogue into consciousness and knowledge. Quote, this is Levinas, Buber allows himself to say, and Levinas quoting Buber, all dialogue draws its authenticity from consciousness of the element of Umfassung, inclusion. Consciousness reappears between Umfassung. Relation itself, apart from its goal, differs from knowledge, end quote. So Levinas equates Buber's conception of inclusion with knowledge, and that's the criticism. But what Levinas does not understand is that inclusion is not static but dynamic. Becoming I in order to say you requires an exposedness of I to you and you to me, an exposedness that consciousness cannot hold. I use the term hold purposely because holding is precisely the metaphor that Winnicott uses for both the mother-child and therapist-patient relationship. A mother holds her child both by initially permitting the child the illusion of omnipotence and then by allowing the child to experience the frustration of her impotence. This twofold holding lets a child develop a sense of herself as a true self, as well as a sense of the reality of the world in which she finds herself. A good enough analyst, according to Winnicott, allows the patient to experience this process in the reverse. Quote, whenever we understand a patient in a deep way and show that we do so by a correct and well-timed interpretation, we are in fact holding the patient and taking part in a relationship in which the patient is, in some degree, regressed and dependent, end quote. My suggestion here is that Buber's Umfassung is the holding environment described by Winnicott. This brings us to a particular irony when it comes to Levinas's criticism of Buber. Once we understand that the I-thou relation is a holding environment, it would seem that Buber actually makes more room for the otherness of the other than Levinas does. After all, holding requires experiencing the other as a genuine other, rather than what seems to be Levinas's rather generic other, who is always and only naked and destitute. Yet even if this is the case, how does this contribute to feminist philosophy? And more particularly, can holding be reconciled with Buber's conception of mutuality? So it's to these questions that I am now turning. So part 3, mutuality, asymmetry, and vulnerability. Not all I-thou relations are mutual. This was mentioned by Sarah Scott yesterday, and I'm going to elaborate on this a bit here. Buber makes this clear in the postscript to I and thou. Some relations are simply not reciprocated, of course. Human relations do sometimes, if not often, and maybe almost always, fail. But some I-thou relations cannot be mutual or fully reciprocal because of the nature of the relation. Quote, there are some I-thou relationships which in their nature may not unfold to full mutuality if they are to persist in that nature, end quote. In his postscript, Buber describes 3 such relationships. These are the teacher-pupil relationship, the therapeutic relationship, and what he calls the pastoral relationship. Each of these relationships is not symmetrical, but asymmetrical. The asymmetry that Buber points to in these relations is different from Levinas's asymmetry. For the latter, that is for Levinas, asymmetry means that I owe the other everything and the other owes me nothing. As some feminists have noted, quote, the manner of response that a Levinas-inspired intimate ethics lauds is precisely the kind of response demanded of subordinates, characteristic of a traditional feminine caring or mothering model, end quote. In this way, Levinasian asymmetry might characterize not the good enough mother, but rather the mother who is expected to sacrifice all for her family and her children, and we might call this mother the too good mother. From Winnicott's and also Buber's point of view, this kind of asymmetry does not allow the other to tolerate her own otherness, but rather gives in to the other's illusion that, like the baby, she is omnipotent. In this context, it's not surprising that Levinas describes the asymmetrical relation as being held hostage or being responsible for one's torturer. The flip side of this is that Levinasian asymmetry can also become a kind of altruistic narcissism, in which I respond to the demands of the other only to lessen my own distress at the other's suffering. To be sure, I'm not here offering a full account of the complex contours of Levinas's philosophy. I'm using it here in an attempt to describe what Buber and Winnicott do not embrace in their acknowledgement of the necessity of some asymmetry in some relationships. Buber's meditations on the asymmetry inherent in the therapeutic relationship align well with Winnicott's thought. For both, the therapist must hold the other, but if the other were to reciprocate, that is, if the patient were to become the therapist's therapist, the therapeutic relationship would be destroyed. On the one hand, this asymmetry brings with it a certain hierarchy. This is undeniable. But on the other hand, this asymmetry points to the ways in which the therapist makes herself vulnerable to the patient. For the therapist may never rest in her experience of knowledge of the patient, but must rather always be open to being surprised by the patient. In this, the therapist relinquishes her own authority. This is what it means to hold a patient. Holding is not static but fluid. The holder must repeatedly shift her position by the movement of that which is being held. So, before turning to how I think this can relate to Buber's contribution to contemporary feminist thought, I don't want to deny, of course, that there is mutuality for Buber in some relationships. And we've heard about some of this mutuality. It was interesting to me that today some of the discussion in the morning about Buber and Paula's relationship and about marriages and I-thou relationship is this mutual relation. Winnicott talks about friendship as this kind of mutuality, and one of the papers we heard also talked about Buber's friendship with Landauer and Rosenzweig in narrative, and how that is also a kind of mutuality. So while I'm stressing here that way in which asymmetry is our I-thou can be I-thou relationships, I'm not. Of course, there is still mutuality, but those are pretty rare, I guess is what I want to say. So let's turn now to Buber's contribution to contemporary feminist thought. I suggested that considering Buber's contemporary contribution to feminist thought requires leaving behind his discussion of women and the womb of the Great Mother. But this does not, and this is, I want to stress this, mean leaving behind Buber's consideration of the child. In I Am Now, Buber muses on the child's relationship to a teddy bear in terms we hear echoed in Winnicott's discussion of the transitional object. Quote, "The child lives between sleep and sleep. A great part of his waking hours is also in sleep, in the flash and counter-flashing of meeting. These very glances will, after protracted attempts, settle on the red carpet pattern and not be moved till the soul of the red has opened itself to them. And this very movement of the hands will win from a woolly teddy bear its precise form, apparent to the senses, and become lovingly and unforgettably aware of a complete body. Neither of these acts is experience of an object, but is the correspondence of the child, to be sure only fanciful, with what is alive and effective over against him. It is simply not the case that the child first perceives an object, then, as it were, puts himself in relation with it, but the effort to establish relation comes first." Strikingly, with his discussion of the teddy bear, Buber seems to paint a picture of Winnicott's transitional object. But in I Am Now, we find a transitional object without a mother. The good enough mother is absent. I don't mean here to psychologize Buber or to reduce his thought to his mother's absence, but we must note this absence since mothering arguably epitomizes the asymmetrical I-thou relationship that Buber attributes to the therapist, teacher, and pastor. If the therapist, teacher, and pastor can hold the other, it is because the mother holds her child, and not just in the undifferentiated environment of the womb, but in the real world, in which the mother both meets the demands of the child and subsequently allows the child to experience the vexation of not having his demands met. This is where the longing for relation comes from the good enough mother who first tolerates not just her infant's infinite demands, but also her own frustration when she chooses not to placate the infant by responding to all of his demands, so that the infant can become a human being capable of relationship. Unlike the idealized womb of the Great Mother, the good enough mother is not perfect. This is part of what makes her good enough. Buber's womb of the Great Mother, or his woman as world, discussed by Vivian Liska last night, is a beautiful soul, which Randy just discussed in the last paper, who, in Hegel's world, words lacks, quote, an actual existence in its unreconciled immediacy, end quote. Bringing Buber into dialogue with Winnicott highlights Buber's failure to recognize mothering beyond essence as a, if not the, central model for the I-thou relationship. But bringing Buber into dialogue with Winnicott also demonstrates some of the ways in which Buber's dialogical philosophy actually has the resources to do precisely this. So I want to just, coming towards an end, I just want to connect this next comment that Winnicott makes to the discussion that Abigail was talking about in the correspondence between Buber and Bertha Pappenheim. And so this is one of the, I think, more interesting things that Winnicott writes, quote, "The most remarkable thing about a mother is her ability to be hurt so much by her baby, and to hate so much without paying the child out, and her ability to await for rewards that may or may not come at a later date." So the mother can, what he's saying is part of being a good enough mother is actually the moments in which the mother also hates the child, okay? Perhaps she is helped by some of the nursery rhymes she sings, which her baby enjoys but fortunately does not understand. Rock-a-bye baby on the treetop, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock, when the bough breaks, the cradle will fall, down will come baby, cradle and all, which is pretty terrible, but I think of a mother or father, and that's Winnicott who puts in or father, playing with a small infant, the infant enjoying the play and not knowing that the parent is expressing hate in the words, perhaps in birth symbolism. This is not a sentimental rhyme. Sentimentality is useless for parents as it contains a denial of hate, and sentimentality in a mother is no good at all from the infant's point of view. So I think this really goes well that actually love is connected to hatred and also to all kinds of other emotions. And so I think there's a really interesting parallel here. Just as empathy is the opposite of inclusion, which necessitates holding the I and you separately together in what can be an uncomfortable tension, so too sentimentality is the opposite of a good mother's love. Sentimentality, like empathy, is all about me being comfortable. But true relation, like true love, requires not just the possibility of mutuality, but also the possibility of holding conflict within oneself while holding the other. This is what a good enough mother does. Buber did not have a good enough mother, but he should have. Every child deserves a good enough mother. And while Buber's I and Thou, the book, does not have a good enough mother, it should have. Because, as I have argued, Buber's dialogical philosophy points to the good enough mother as the model for the dialogical relation. So I'll come now to my conclusion. I've argued in this paper that it is necessary to move beyond Buber's essentialization of women and the feminine in order to recognize that Buber's dialogical philosophy offers a conception of mothering beyond essence. This is an important contribution to feminist philosophy in both acknowledging what is unique about a mother's role in human relations, while also avoiding relegating women only to traditional roles, and also making room for people who are not women to mother. By way of conclusion, I want to reflect briefly on how a consideration of mothering beyond essence might also allow us to think more about Buber's conception of God. So in the postscript of to I and Thou, Buber addresses confusion over his claim that God is the eternal you. He writes, quote, "The description of God as a person is indispensable for everyone who, like myself, means by God not a principle, not an idea. By God I mean whatever else he may be, enters into a direct relation with men in revealing and redeeming acts, and thus makes it possible for us to enter into a direct relationship with him. The concept of personal being is indeed completely incapable of declaring what God's essential being is, but it is both permitted and necessary to say that God is also a person. The existence of mutuality between God and man cannot be proved, just as God's existence cannot be proved. Yet he who dares to speak of it bears witness and calls to witness him to whom he speaks, whether that witness is now or in the future," end quote. But Buber was aware not only of God's presence, but also of God's absence. As is well known, Buber draws on the notion of Hester Panim, the eclipse of God, which refers to God's hiding his face. The term is originally biblical, occurring in Deuteronomy 31:17, when God says, quote, "And I will forsake them, the children of Israel, and I will hide my face from them, and they shall be devoured," end quote. And later in the prophets, in its original contexts, Hester Panim connotes a God who bestows rewards on those who obey his commandments and punishes the wicked by hiding his face from them. The idea of a retributive God may be difficult for many people today, and maybe should be difficult for people today, but following Jewish mystical traditions, Buber interprets the term hopefully, for a hiding God is a God who can also be found. As he writes, "Eclipse of the light of heaven, eclipse of God, such indeed is the character of the historic hour through which the world is passing. An eclipse of the sun is something that occurs between the sun and our eyes, not in the sun itself." End quote. Could Buber's God be like the good enough mother, who allows her child to experience loneliness and longing, so that the child may build a world of her own for the sake of genuine relationship? The good enough mother is always there, despite the appearance of her absence. She, like God, both responds and withdraws. Would she do otherwise, she would not be good enough, and we would not be capable of relating to her or to anyone else. Thank you.